One of the more important decisions you make as a woman and choose as a Filipina is whether or not to pursue a foreign boyfriend or husband or a local Filipino. Now, obviously, my experience is skewed as an American that has spent time in the Philippines over the last 15 years, meaning the women that meet me are all convinced that a foreign boyfriend, an American boyfriend, is better than a Filipino. And so I can list the reasons that they tell me. There's a couple of things. So one is that many Filipinas have had experience with irresponsible young Filipinos, meaning they don't provide financially, they may or may not have a job, so that's one aspect. They get them pregnant and do not marry them or leave them with children to raise alone. They drink a lot and sometimes smoke a lot, right? So there's gambling, drinking, and smoking, but there's not, they're not providing for their family. There's also domestic violence, ranging from rape to verbal abuse, physical abuse. That is, I think, well, it's hard to say because I'm meeting the women that are dissatisfied with male Filipinos. And so the rates are pretty high. I would say that almost 100% of the Filipinas that I meet complain about these things. Verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, gambling, drinking, smoking, not providing, and of course the last is cheating. Filipinos, cheat on Filipinas and go off and have sex with other women. So the women that I meet are interested in avoiding that. They want someone that's going to be a good provider, that's going to be responsible, that isn't going to get drunk, that isn't going to cheat on them, and is going to, in various ways, create a better life. Now, let's look at each of these parts because it's normal, if you've had a bad experience with one group of people, to try another group of people. Now, this is also, you could call it racism or groupism. It's basically saying that, a lot of Filipinos do this, so I'd like to try a foreigner. So that's one way to handle it, right? So it's racism, right? I'm just going to give up on my race and try another race. Now that's the bit that I want to dive into because let's look at each of these things statistically. Now, I was just over in Palawan and spending time in various families, and I would say, in the broadest terms, that, I live in California. And it also depends because the problem with racism is it's a generalization. And there are generalizations, but you're never dealing with a race. You're dealing with an individual. I'm an individual. You're not going to meet many Americans like me. You're an individual. I may or may not meet many Filipinas like you. And so the problem with racism is it's good for broad strategy, but you always want to focus on the individual. Now, in the broadest strategies, I have seen more drunken Filipinos than I have seen drunken Americans. I went to a birthday party, drunken Filipinos, all of them, drunk, singing karaoke. I went to a Christmas party. 20% of the men were drunk. I stayed at a friend's house, and her sister's husband was getting drunk every night. I don't know any people in my neighborhood that are doing that in San Francisco. And so on a broad stroke, I would say that maybe there's 10 times more drinking among Filipino males. And the same is actually true in Thailand. I see a lot of men getting drunk at the end of the day. So I've never been drunk in my life. I don't like the feeling if I drink half a beer or drink a little whiskey. I like the taste, but sometimes I'll spit it out or just have a very little amount because I don't like my brain becoming fuzzy. I want to think clearly. So I would say there are, in my experience, there is 10 times more drinking amongst Filipino men than American men. But again, you have to look at the individual, because some of the reasons that American men go to the Philippines is they want to drink more than they would drink at home. And so they're just as drunk as the average Filipino. And so you have to look at the individual, but that's on the drinking. Smoking has gone down in the US in the last 20 years, but remains high amongst Filipinos. So I think there's more smoking in the Philippines. Now, next we come to income. And I do get the impression that there is more employment in the US and perhaps in Europe than there is in the Philippines. But it's a mixed bag because, first of all, the Filipinos that I see working, they work harder. They work longer hours in many cases than Americans. But it is more common. I would say that if you want to work in the US, you pretty much can. I started my company when I was 17 years old. And if you want to work and you're a good worker, you can get work in America. That's not always the case in the Philippines. If you want to work and you're a good worker in the Philippines, you may not get a job. And if you do, it will be much lower pay. For example, I own a landscape company in the US. I've owned it since I was 17 years old. And I pay my workers, let's say, 1,300 pesos an hour. Roughly 1,300 pesos for 1 hour of work. If I'm in the Philippines, people could be working harder for 100 pesos an hour, right? So 13 times less, 20 times less, 50 times less, because many people are working for less than 50 pesos an hour. Some are working for 30 pesos an hour. So 10 to 50 times less money is available for a Filipino worker, particularly if they don't have a number of degrees. Now, in the United States, you can get, good, for example, the employees that I hire for 1,300 pesos a day, they barely speak English, they have no formal education, but they work hard, right? So it's easy to get a job without college degrees in the US. It's harder in the Philippines, right? So, but I would say generally speaking, particularly if an American or a European has enough money to fly to the Philippines and take time off work and come back, they're going to be making a lot more money than a Filipino. However, for example, 60% of Americans have a lot of debts, and they do not have any savings, right? So if you take 60%, maybe 200 million Americans, They have credit cards. They barely have enough money to pay their rent, to pay their food, and if they can't get sick, they'll lose everything. It's not a very strong economy for maybe 60, 70% of Americans. But usually they're not traveling over to the Philippines. They may be writing, but they're not they don't have enough money to, spend 50,000 pesos on a plane ticket and another 50,000 on this and that. And so if you meet someone over in the Philippines, usually they have a little bit of money. Maybe they're retired, and they can definitely make a lot more money in the U.S. than could be made in the Philippines. However, expenses are also much higher in the U.S. For example, the rent on this house where I'm staying in San Francisco is 250,000 pesos a month. So my rent is 250,000 pesos a month. And my insurance for my business is 50,000 pesos a month. My insurance for my car it's not 50,000 a month, it's 50,000 a year. And then 50,000 a year for my car insurance. And my food is 50,000 pesos a month. And my clothing. And so it all adds up to, my living expense here is about 500,000 pesos a month. And so I make a lot more, but I spend a lot more. And so a lot of people in Western countries and in the US, they don't have a lot of money to retire or save. Sometimes they have more debt than they have savings. In fact, the majority of Americans, they owe more money in debts. And so, for example, a few years ago, I had 10 million pesos in debt. And I worked hard to pay that down. And so now I have no debt. But the majority of Americans have debt that's in excess of their savings. So I would say that 90% of the time, or 95% of the time, if you date a foreigner, they will make a lot more money than you do, or a Filipino, 90% of the time. So that's a reasonable assumption. Now, the next thing is around quality of life, because money does not translate directly into quality of life. You can be very rich, very depressed, very lonely, very sad, filled with self-hatred, in bad health. There's a lot of wealthy, unhappy people in the United States. And to some extent, I would consider myself amongst them. I have a lot of psychological pain, a lot of stress, depression, loneliness, and I'm in pretty good health physically. And one of the things that is, I think, hard for many Filipinas to understand, because they've never been to the US, is, for example, when I spend time in the Philippines, I'm 350% happier. I start losing weight. I enjoy my life more. I exercise more. I spend time with people I like. I'm 3.5 times happier in the Philippines than I am in the US. Now, this is a cultural and an environmental shift, meaning right now it's quite cold out. If I step outside my door, it's cold. There's not a lot of nightlife. I have relatively few friends in the US. It's harder to make friends. And Americans tend to be much more broken up with their families. For example, I have not talked with a single family member in 6 months. And when I last talked with my brother, we had a fight. Now, that's very normal in America, to have distant, broken families that are too busy to communicate. Now, it's not normal in the Philippines. in the Philippines, when I spent time with a friend's family, there were 50 family members all came together. They all got along well, and they had a great time together, and they get together regularly. So the Philippines, I would say, is 10 times better for social interactions with family and with friends. You are more likely to have friends in the Philippines than in the US. You're more likely to have family. Now, there's a lot of terrible families in the Philippines that I've gotten to know by talking with different women about their families, horrific families. But statistically, you are more likely to have a good family bond in the Philippines than in the US by, 300 to 1,000%. And so I learn a lot from Filipinas and family, like, wow, like, how do you all get together so well? So that's an area to be proud of. It's an area that I admire and I'm learning about because, as I say, I don't have close relationships with any of my family members. Now, that's not because there's more abuse in America than in the Philippines, but it is a different cultural attitude. So there's a lot of childhood abuse, sexual abuse, you name it, in the Philippines. And there's a lot of that in America. But in America, when a child becomes a teenager and they rebel, they complain, they criticize their parents, usually the parents don't respond very well. And so the family breaks up, right? And then Americans pursue their separate lives. There's no sense that a family should stay together in America. And so most families don't. But in the Philippines, they still stay together, right? I spoke with a Filipina. She'd been sexually pursued by an uncle. She'd been abused by her father. Her sister had stolen money from her. All kinds of, uncomfortable, painful, lonely abuses. But they still stuck together as a family. In the United States, there's much more of a distancing attitude. Fuck you, you stole from me, I'm not talking to you again. And that's the end, right? There's no reconciliation in many cases. Or, you're a lousy parent, you gambled the money, you didn't show up, I don't want you as a parent. That's a very common attitude in the US. And so what happens, because people are not perfect and people, make mistakes at different points, is Americans can have zero friends. They reject this friend because they borrowed a book and they'd never returned it and they didn't apologize, so I don't want you as a friend. And this other friend because they didn't make an effort to call back because they were busy. And this one, they moved away, and so they have no friends. And so in the Philippines, there's more understanding, there's more grace, there's more acceptance of mistakes. And so that's a big, big difference in the culture. So if you marry, for example, an American and come over to the US, you may find that there's no family connection. Or the family gets together once a year and they have fights and it's uncomfortable. There's a lot of jokes in the US about Thanksgiving. Like, could you survive Thanksgiving, right? So you supposedly come together as a family to give thanks, but really you get together and avoid bringing up judgmental topics. I judge you for that, you judge me for that. And then you try and survive it, and then you have nothing to do with each other for another year, right? And so that's very, very different from the Philippines. And this is one reason you may be more lonely, more isolated, and more unhappy, because a big part of happiness is good social relationships. And America has been steadily losing good social relationships for decades. For example, 30 years ago, Americans had 2 or 3 friends. Now it's less than 1 friend, right? So social media and various things is making things worse culturally. There's also more political conflict because 30 years ago, America was a growing economy and was becoming, was still a world leader. Now that focus is shifting to China. And so American culture and economy is going down. Chinese culture and economy is going up. Americans don't like that, so they're fighting more with one another. And so, that's something that you need to be, aware of. So, you may find, like I do, that you are 3.5 times more comfortable, you enjoy your life more in the Philippines than in the US. Now, there are exceptions. There are some really good things about American culture. One is, first of all, Americans love Asian women. So Philippines is part of, the general region. Filipinas, in many ways, are more attractive than the average American woman, right? And so it's not a blanket statement again, but Americans love Asian women. Americans love Filipino women. And so you can be more attractive and more noticeable, and you stand out more in America. That's one reason. The other thing is that, if you want to work hard and learn something, you can get a job in America without any degree. And it's not hard to make 1,500 pesos an hour. It's not hard at all, right? Now, it's very easy to spend all that money, right? And so you can go into debt, right? I know a Filipina who came to America, and before she was making 6,000 pesos on a golf course. So she made 6,000 pesos a month, but she had no debt. She came to America, she made $6,000, 56 times more money, but she was offered credit cards and she went into debt. She has more debt now than she had when she came to America. So she had no debt, so she didn't have any money, but she didn't have any debt. Now she has more debt than she has money, even though she makes 56 times more money, right? 6,000 pesos, you have 56 pesos in the dollar, right? So now she makes $6,000, 56 times more money. But because she doesn't manage it well, because she's addicted to spending, she has less money now than she had when she's in the Philippines because she owes all this high-interest credit card money, right? And so if you don't learn new skills to manage money and be disciplined, you can easily be poorer in the U.S. than in the Philippines. And so that's something to definitely understand. What about physical abuse? I would say there's a little bit less of it in the U.S. than in the Philippines, because alcohol and physical abuse often go together, and there's less drinking in the US than there is in the Philippines. So I would say if you spend time with an American in the long term, you're probably cut your physical abuse in half, statistically speaking, meaning there are 50% less Americans who will physically abuse you than Filipinos. And a lot of that has to do with alcohol consumption. What about verbal abuse? It's different. There's a lot of judgment in American culture. Americans are always criticizing themselves and other people. So it's in the Philippines that takes the form of gossip. It's cruel. It's sick. There's a tremendous amount of Filipino gossip. In the US, there's much less gossip. So probably 10 times more gossip in the Philippines. Now, in America, there's a lot of privacy and freedom. For example, whatever you want to do in your own house is up to you. In the Philippines, they're going to gossip about that. And because there's nipa huts and things, everyone's going to know what's going on in your house. Not so in America. For example, in my neighborhood, nobody pays any attention to anyone. I don't know the names of my neighbors. They don't know my name. I don't visit my neighbors. They don't visit me. In a little neighborhood in the Philippines, everyone is gossiping and knowing about each other. So if you don't like to be gossiped about, then the U.S. is 10 times better in that way. There's also more religious freedoms in the U.S. There's more political freedom. There's a little bit less corruption in the U.S. There's corruption everywhere, but there's less corruption in the U.S. And so, you're not going to be asked for bribes. So it's in that sense, it's better. The roads are much better. There's lots of the air is cleaner. There's things like that. But, if we go back and look at the big picture, the first thing I would say is that Americans are more stressed out than Filipinos. As a general rule, Americans are 3 times more stressed out than Filipinos. And they have a lot of tension. There's a lot of addiction here. And I don't think that's any different because there's lots of addiction in the Philippines. But here there's a lot of work addiction to work, addiction to worrying, addiction to stress. And so there's a lot of loneliness, a lot of unhappiness. Personally, if I could live in the Philippines or live in the U.S., I'm moving to the Philippines. And so I would live in the Philippines because I feel 3.5 times happier. I also, because I've never had a close family, because I have very few close friends, and because it's very difficult to make friends in America. If you don't want to talk about money and business, which I don't enjoy spending my social time talking about, then it's very hard to make friends. And there's a lot of scheduling, like to spend time with your family or friends, you make appointments for little windows weeks in advance. Whereas in the Philippines, you just see each other every day or every night. And I like that organic feeling. Now, so let's kind of go over the kind of the lists. So we have money, we have drinking, we have abuse, we have, so money, drinking, abuse, privacy, we have irresponsibility, like leaving a woman without paying for a child. We have loneliness. Right. So let's look, and then we have cheating. Okay. Now, there are just as many cheaters pretty much around the world. This is for a very basic reason. If we look historically at, the evolution of human beings, we're closely related to monkeys and chimpanzees. And for example, many monkeys have sex 10 times a day with whoever is nearby. Sex feels good, and that's how a species grows and procreates. And so biologically, men are wanting to have sex several times a day. And it is only the culture that says, no, you should only have sex with one person, and you should spend all this time working, and then you have sex a few times a week. But biologically, most of our ancestors, our monkeys, etc., or even certain tribes, perhaps in the Philippines before the Spanish arrived, there'd be much more open relationship. You feel attracted to someone, you have sex, the baby is raised by the community or by the pack of monkeys. So biologically, men and women enjoy having sex at least once a day, and it's very natural. Then you take culture on top of that biology and say, no, don't have sex when you're working, don't have sex here, don't have sex there, don't have sex in public, don't do this, don't do that. And you take all that biological code and urge and you reduce it down to like 5%. Right? So you want to have sex naturally and freely 100% of the time, but the culture says no, only 5%. You can't have sex with men, you can't have sex with women, you can't have, it's reduced down to this little trickle. Now, about 30% of people want to be in a monogamous relationship. They really want to be together all the time and grow together. So they're very happy in that situation. And so, once they find a good compatible partner, they grow and stay together biologically. About 30% of people, they enjoy different qualities with different people, right? And so whether it's men or whether it's women, they find it exciting or interesting or healing or it's just practical. Like my husband is traveling, I feel a bit lonely, I'd like to have sex. I like this guy over here, he's available, he wants to have sex with me too. So it's practical in some situations, right? I'm at university, my boyfriend's over here, I feel a bit lonely, I want to have sex, I feel better when I have sex. So there's practicality, there's also curiosity, there's also the fact that every person is different. And so biologically, most mammals, right, most men and women will enjoy having more than one partner. But culturally, it is taboo, right? Culturally, they say, no, you're only supposed to have one boyfriend or one girlfriend, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Now, in the Philippines, I would say the majority of men and women cheat. And what I mean by that is the man says, oh, I'll only have sex with you, and then they go and have sex with somebody else. And so that's called cheating because they say they're going to do this, but then they do that, right? Now, it's usually the man who pursues the woman, but not always. But for example, I've had sex with a number of Filipinas over the last 15 years, and almost none of them asked any questions about my relationships in the US, meaning they don't want to know, they're not interested, they want to have sex with me. And so that's also a form of participation in infidelity or in open relationship because you're not interested, you're not learning about, you're not asking about what's the situation back home or overseas. And if I've told Filipinas, I have a girlfriend in the US, they're perfectly happy to have sex. In other words, they're happy to support me to be in an open relationship. Now, so as far as I can tell, about 70% of Filipino men have sex with other Filipinas and lie to their partners. So you could say that the cheating rate in the Philippines is about 70%. And in the US, I would say that it's maybe 50%, that about 50% of the men have cheated or are cheating at any given point. However, in the US, a lot more of it is not cheating, it's in open relationship or polyamorous. For example, in San Francisco, 30% of the women that I talk to tell me that they're happy to have me as a lover, but they have another boyfriend and another boyfriend. And there's no lying about it. There's not cheating. They just say, I enjoy having multiple lovers. And so I would say that the sexual activity is about the same in the US as it is in the Philippines, but in America, there's more honesty about it, right? And so there's a lot more open relationships, polyamorous, meaning we love more than one person and everyone accepts it. And so everyone's happy, right? Because you have agreements. You say like, okay, if you have sex with somebody else, you're going to use a condom, but with me, you're not going to use a condom. Or you have an agreement that you will get tested for HIV before having sex with somebody else, and they have tests. You can order a test online. You give it to your partner 20 minutes later. You know if they have HIV again. And if they're negative, then they will not, you don't have to use a condom, right? And so these agreements are discussed practically and honestly with partners, right? So there's not more or less sex in the US, but there's more honesty in the US about the sex. And so if you want to be honest, then you have to deal with the fact that most people are attracted to more than one person. Number one. Number two, that new people are always attractive, right? If you've spent time being sexual with someone for 5 years and then somebody starts courting you, they're going to be exciting because they're new. In the same way that a new book is more interesting than an old book, or a new piece of music is more interesting than an old piece of music. And that's part of biology. It's part of human nature. It's new, it's exciting, you've never had it before, there's a mystery, there's adrenaline. So a new lover is always going to be more exciting than an old lover. And we like excitement, as it feels good in our body to be excited. So I would say that if you want honesty, you will have more honesty in America than in the Philippines, but you will not have more fidelity. So for example, I will tell someone that I have a lover here that I visit when I visit this place, and she understands that I may have other lovers. And I have a lover over here, and she also understands that I may have other lovers. We've both been tested for HIV. We're not having children together, but when I visit Taiwan, maybe I will see her a few times a year. And she's free to see other men, right? This is an honest form of sexuality. But it is not only one woman or only one man. It's just honest. So, in my opinion, because every single Filipina that I have dated in the Philippines has been cheated on by one or more Filipino men, right? I have never cheated, meaning I've never lied to a woman. But I have had sex with different women. So I don't think the sex is different, but I think the lying is different, right? Because of the influence of the Catholic religion in Filipino culture. It's odd because foreigners, the Spanish, brought Catholicism to Filipinos who didn't used to be Catholic. So now they're Catholic. Now, the Spanish also brought Catholicism to the U.S., but the U.S. is less sexually religious than the Philippines, right? And so there's more of a separation of church and state. So ironically, the Philippines is more religious than America is. And so there's more cultural pressure around sex. And so there's more dishonesty around sex. Now, one thing that's very different in the US is that if a Filipino has sex with a woman and then goes off and she gets pregnant, the majority of Filipinos do not help raise that child. So I meet women all the time. They have 1, 2, 3, 4 children, and then the man leaves. And she raises the children alone. That doesn't happen as much in the US. Now, part of that is the women. Like I talked with a Filipina friend in the other day. Now, she learned that the Filipino man who got her pregnant, she learned after she had 2 children, she learned that he had his own family and his own wife. And the way that she learned that was the son-in-law of the one who was cheating and having 2 families wanted to seduce her. And so he wanted to turn her lover against, he wanted to turn her against her lover so that he could have sex with her and he could cheat, right? So you have, on the one hand, you have this family. At first, the family colluded, helped the father to cheat and have 2 families and lie about it to the woman. But then one of the family members wanted to have sex with her, and so he told the secret. So he's trying to cheat and seduce her, so he betrays the other family member. And she finds it all disgusting, so she runs away and hides from him and raises her children alone without any money support, right? So that happens all the time in the Philippines. It doesn't happen all the time in the US. And this is the last Filipina that I spent time with. This is her story, right? And so, I don't hear this kind of horror stories in the US. I hear them from Filipinas. It's heartbreaking, right? In the US, there are all kinds of laws and protections for women so that if you have an unwanted pregnancy by an American man, the men pay a lot of money. It costs 20 million pesos to raise a child in America. 20 million pesos to raise a child in America. And many times, the majority of the time, the father, both by law but also tradition, does not just run away from the woman. And so if you're tired of men getting you pregnant in the Philippines and running away and not helping you in any way, then America is going to be a good place. But only if you have a married American man come to you on vacation and get you pregnant and then you don't have their identification and all that, there's a lot of that, right? But if you're in America, or if you get married, or you have all the identification, that's not as likely. And so you're going to be happier with an American man in that area. But I also want to say that in Europe, right? In Europe, you may be happier still, because in Europe, there's less work addiction, there's fewer hours, there's more family and social interactions in Europe. So if I was a Filipina, I might want to marry someone from Denmark more than an American. I might want to marry someone from Sweden more than an American. I might want to marry someone from, or have a boyfriend, right? Depending on what it is. But I love Denmark. I like Denmark more than I like the US. When I've spent time in Denmark, it's a wonderful, wonderful country relative to the US. So if I was a Filipina and I wanted to be married to a foreigner, I would try and date someone in Denmark. However, there's another thing to consider, and that is that there are many Filipinas that are lazy and have the attitude that a foreigner is going to take care of them and raise them and their children, and that that's the way it should be. And sometimes that does happen. But for example, I have worked for myself and have run my own business since I was 17, and I want a hardworking woman. I don't want a lazy person who's going to leave me to do all the work and make all the money. I want someone who's independent and hardworking. So you may find that you expect, here's someone with all this money, and so, let's just have them take care of me. But they may actually expect you to work much harder and think more and study more. Because a typical American woman will work 1, 2, or 3 jobs, will study and learn, will be very professional, right? And will not be very proud of herself for just laying around and depending on a man. A typical American woman wants to be independent, make their own money, and grow. And so that means you have to think, you have to study, you have to work hard. And so I wouldn't expect life to be easier in the US or in Europe than in the Philippines necessarily. Because if you do have a good Filipino male that will provide for you and you stay at home and raise the children in a nice tropical country, in nature, it could be much, much easier for you than living as an independent woman who's expected to make her own money in Europe or the US. So I hope that gives you a little bit of information. And in general, I want to say that connecting 2 different cultures brings more benefit than harm. I benefit, meaning I enjoy dating Filipinas more than I enjoy dating Americans because there's a different culture. Like when I spend time with a Filipina family, it's a new thing for me. It's like, oh, I've never done this with my family like this. And so that's new. The food is also way more interesting in Europe or in the US than in the Philippines. Rice and fish is a very common diet in the Philippines. My diet, I'll eat Indian food one day, I'll eat Chinese food another day, I'll eat Mexican food another day, I'll eat Italian food another day, I'll eat American food, the next day I'll eat Greek food, the next day I'll have fusion food, and every meal is different, and most of them does not include rice, right? Whereas in the Philippines, you just eat rice and pork and rice and fish and whatever, and to me, it's incredibly boring. And so you can have a whole bunch of new experiences if you travel abroad. So I love dating Filipinas more than I like dating Americans, and simultaneously, the Filipinas that spend time with me enjoy spending time with me much more than they enjoy spending time with people in their own culture. Because it's new, each culture has its strength. For example, Filipinas tend to be more emotional than Americans, and that's good. Filipinas tend to be more passionate than Americans, and that's good, right? But Americans tend to be more intellectual than Filipinos. So you can stretch your mind by dating someone in another culture. You can learn things you'll never learn in your own culture, right? You can learn to become independent and powerful in your, by learning from an American woman or an American man or a British, or an Australian. And so there's a lot of benefit to learning 2 different cultures. There's also a benefit to learning different languages. If you learn to speak English fluently, you have many job opportunities that you don't have if you just speak it, 20 or 30%. So I hope this gives you good information This is also normal American analytical thinking. Pros and cons, weigh this and weigh that. Whereas in the Philippines, you might just follow your feelings, but it always feels good to have sex. It always feels good, right? And I meet Filipinas all across the Philippines who are left alone, who are abandoned with children, who they feel betrayed, and they feel betrayed by the men who left them and ran off with other women. That doesn't feel good. Now, in the US, there's much more analysis of the future, and I'm not going to do that because it's not good for the future. In the Philippines, there's much more enjoyment of the moment. And so you have lots and lots and lots of single mothers with children that they're burdened with for many years, and then they leave the children again to become OFWs. That doesn't happen. We don't have OFWs in America, right? If you have a child in America, you raise that child together, or at least with financial support. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know what your experience is. Let me know what your thoughts are, and if there's anything that you've learned in watching this video.